You're about to hear the message, Blessed Are the Persecuted, by Phil Brainerd, presented on July 12th, 2020 to Trinity Church of Teaneck, New Jersey. We hope you enjoy it. I'm going to start off today with a bad joke. This was a pretty good joke years ago, but today maybe not so much. Let me explain it. They say if you have to explain a joke, it's not funny. Well, listen and you'll see why I'm doing this. Lots of people like pizza. Everyone has a different idea of what they want on their pizza. Some like pepperoni or other meats. Some like veggies. Some like pineapple. We'll forgive those people. Some people like all different kinds of toppings all at once. They want all different kinds of meats along with all different kinds of veggies. So years ago, when those people ordered a pizza, they would say, "I'd like a pizza with everything on it." Okay, here's the joke. Have you heard about the new cannibal pizza? That's a pizza with everybody on it. We don't have a slide with that picture on it. Normally I'd just say use your imagination, but maybe we shouldn't go there. Anyway, that particular joke fits our message today, just not right away. File the joke away while we introduce today's topic. We're in our series, The King and I. Matthew tells us about the King of the universe. We're working our way through the Gospel according to Matthew. We're still in chapters 5 through 7, which I'm calling the Christian Manifesto. Today we're finishing up the Beatitudes. Those are 9 statements that start with the word blessed. So people who match these statements are blessed. That means they're very happy. They've arrived at a wonderful place in life. Here is the last of these statements. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10, we read this: "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." As we've been studying these 9 statements over our last many sessions, we've understood that they appear at first to be out of tune with the world's way of thinking. For example, the world might say, "Blessed are those who are happy." Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." The world says that the powerful are blessed. Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek." Today's statement might be hardest of all to understand. Jesus says, "Blessed are the persecuted." Persecution doesn't sound good at all. How could Jesus say something like that? Let's dig in and find out. First, let's ask the question, what is persecution? We'll look at Lexico, the online Oxford Dictionary of the English language. They define persecution as hostility and ill treatment, especially because of race or political or religious beliefs. Example, her family fled religious persecution. That's a good start. I think, though, that we need to go deeper. We need a definition that fits the biblical model of discipleship that Jesus is presenting in his Christian Manifesto. The current definition is a little too broad for that. Let's bring it back a bit. We'll start with just the word hostility. Why are people sometimes hostile towards others? Well, let's say one person injures another. For example, somebody steps on another person's foot. It's an accident. Or at least we'll say that for the sake of our example. If someone has been injured, they might react with anger or hostility. Though we can argue that anger may not be the best response based on the previous Beatitudes we've been studying, at least we can say that anger would be normal if someone has been injured. It might be considered justified. So persecution isn't just somebody being angry and showing hostility because they feel real pain. It's something more. Next, we'll add the word ill treatment or mistreatment. The word mistreatment implies something unjust. Someone is not being treated fairly. So at this point we have parallel ideas. First, hostility or anger that might be considered just. There's a real injury. Or hostility or anger that's considered unjust. There's no real injury to explain bad treatment of a person. Because there's no real reason, we can add irrational. So persecution falls into the second category. Now, why would a person do that? Why would one person persecute another? Why would they show hostility to someone when they haven't been hurt? Let me suggest an answer to that. There are two reasons for showing hostility. First, somebody thinks they've been hurt. Second, they think they might be hurt. To nail down our definition of persecution, we need to do one more thing. We need to ask, what does hostility accomplish? Or at least, what is it thought to accomplish? Here's the answer. Someone shows hostility to protect themselves or what they care about. When someone shows hostility towards another, it has a purpose. Hostility is meant to keep others away or to drive them away. It's meant to remove a threat. It can also be a form of revenge. You hurt me, so I'll get you back, even if there's no real hurt. So here's a working definition of persecution for us. Persecution is when one person shows hostility and mistreatment to another person who they wrongly believe to be a threat. It's meant to take away the threat. So to understand persecution, we need to understand what a person or group considers to be a threat and why they consider it that way. We need to identify the target of persecution. Okay, so let's ask that. What's the target of persecution? We'll return to the original statement, again in Matthew 5 and verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Think about that. Persecuted because of righteousness. How could righteousness be a threat? Now here's an important point. It is to many people. Why is that? Once again, we need to go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. We've been there many times together, so I'll just quickly review. If you want to learn about the section of Scripture in detail, I'll invite you to go to the church website, trinitytneck.org, and look up the message, Life Answers in Genesis. What went wrong? For now, we'll just look at the main point. God is the creator of the universe. He is the ruler, the rightful king. On top of this, he is incredibly generous with humans. He cherishes us. So, he created the first humans, Adam and Eve, and placed them in a beautiful garden paradise. There he made them rulers over the whole planet. God could not have been any more generous. There was only one rule: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Enter the serpent. The serpent presented 3 temptations to Adam and Eve. The first 2 temptations were meant to soften up Adam and Eve. It was the third that brought them down. We read that in Genesis 3 and verse 5. The serpent said, "For God knows that when you eat from it," that's the tree, "your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." This temptation attacked God's character. It implied that God was holding back something on Adam and Eve. According to the serpent, there were good things that God wasn't giving to them. Now here's an important point. Adam and Eve had no idea what those things were, really, but they seemed valuable. We can look at this in a lot of ways. One way that's relevant to today's study is to say that the serpent convinced Adam and Eve that God was a threat. There was something they wanted. They didn't understand what it was, but they wanted it badly. Whatever it was, God in their minds was in the way. He became a threat. And so they disobeyed. They sinned. This is the core of sin. Sin is what people do when they want the things of God, but they don't want God. And that's a terrible shame. It's a shame because the most valuable thing there is can't be found anywhere in this universe. The most valuable thing is God, and he shares himself freely with anyone who accepts him. He does this because he cherishes us. So if you want the things of God but you don't want God, you have 2 options. One, you can attempt to control God. The other is you can attempt to remove God. Sin is a terrible thing. One reason it's terrible is what it does to us. When Adam and Eve sinned, They didn't just sin for themselves. They started an infection of sin that affected the whole human race. Because of their act, we are all born in sin. In Psalm 51, we read in verse 5, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." You can't get any sooner than conception. We are born sinners. This causes us to be born with a distrust of God. We are born believing that God is a threat. So we try to control him or remove him. Now here's another important point. We can't help ourselves. When lots of sinful people get together, you get what we keep seeing in Psalm 2. We've read it a number of times in our series, so let's read it again. Psalm 2, starting in verse 1. "Why do the nations conspire, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, 'Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles.'" One sinner equals one person trying to control or remove God. Lots of sinners equals a whole world at war with God. People want the things of God without God, so God is in the way of those people getting what they want. He's a threat to them, so they try to kick him off his throne. This is why those who want God, those who want righteousness, will be persecuted. A sinful world sees God as a threat. If you're one of his, if you work for God, if you represent him, you're a threat too. And so the world will be hostile towards you. The world will persecute you. Well, that raises a question. Why would anybody want to be persecuted for righteousness? Because, like the other statements in the Beatitudes, there is a reward. Reading that verse again, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Over the last few sessions, we've discussed the role of peacemakers in the kingdom. Peacemakers, we learned, are people who understand that the world is at war with God. They understand that God offers us peace through Jesus Christ. Peacemakers start by accepting that peace. They then defect from the armies of this world. They begin to pursue God. They pursue his righteousness. For those people, there is a place in God's kingdom. And the kingdom is a wonderful place, a place where we enjoy not just the things of God, but God himself. And we enjoy those things for all eternity. Eternity will happen someday, but we're living in the here and now. So then we ask, what does persecution look like? We'll look at this in 4 ways. First, what did Jesus say in general about persecution? Next, how was he persecuted? That's followed by, how were his followers persecuted? And finally, what might it look like for us if we suffer persecution today? This is the only Beatitude with an expanded explanation. So let's read on in Matthew's book. In Matthew 5 and verse 11, Jesus tells us in general what persecution will look like. We read, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." We don't need to go too deeply into the meanings of these words. We're told that people will be insulted. Others will say all kinds of terrible things. Insults are meant to cause pain. I'm sure you can fill in the blank on all kinds of hurtful things that people say to you when they want to hurt you. Some of the insults will be things that have some truth, but they're exaggerated. Others will be totally false. People will just make them up. We've already looked at the word persecution. That means people will show hostility. That might be exclusion. No getting invited to parties. Maybe that means help won't be offered when somebody's experiencing a problem. Maybe people just won't talk. We all say sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never harm me. Well, sometimes hostility moves over into things that can cause physical harm. Hostility sometimes goes over the line to violence. Maybe persecutors will try to hurt a person's means of making a living. They won't hire you, or they'll find ways to get a person fired. Now, what did this look like in the life of Jesus? Well, let's check a couple of examples. In Luke 7 and verse 33, we read this. For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So we see that John the Baptist led a very disciplined life, with practices like fasting. His enemies said, he must be nuts, he has a demon. Jesus didn't see the need for fasting during his lifetime, so his enemies said he was a glutton. And so we can see that people lied about Jesus. For another example, let's read about what happened to Jesus after he was arrested. In Luke 22, starting to read in verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking him and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, prophesy, who hit you? And they said many other insulting things to him. So here are people who don't even know Jesus. We're told they beat him and mocked him and insulted him. Then Jesus was crucified. He had been horribly whipped. He had a crown of thorns driven into his head, and then he was nailed to a cross. So Jesus went through all the things he said would happen to others. And here's another important note. Many times Jesus does not ask us to do things that he is not willing to do. He is our example. This brings us to the followers of Jesus through history. They suffered a great deal of persecutions, sometimes terrible. Most of the apostles of Jesus died violent deaths. Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified. He asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die the same way his Lord did. James was executed by the sword. Thomas traveled to India, where he had a powerful ministry. Sadly, he was killed by soldiers by being run through with spears. Later, in the early Roman Empire, Christians suffered terrible persecution. At minimum, they had lies told about them. One lie said that Christians had a practice called communion, where they, quote, ate the body and blood of Jesus, unquote. So people said that Christians were cannibals. Another practice that Christians had was greeting one another with a holy kiss. Along with that, they called each other brother and sister. So people said that Christians practiced incest. Some were arrested and had their homes and possessions confiscated. Others were tortured. Some died horrible deaths. They were thrown to wild animals in front of jeering crowds. Some were covered with oil and set on fire to provide light for garden parties. This has happened all throughout church history. This brings us to today. Sadly, there are people all over the world who suffer persecution in the name of Christ. According to an article in the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the British government did a study recently on persecution. Here's what they said. The persecution of Christians in parts of the world is at near genocide levels. This study found that Christianity is one of the most persecuted religions in the world. And I've read that in other places as well. All over the world, Christians have their property confiscated. They're accused of false crimes. They're sent to jail. While in jail, they're treated horribly. They're unable to be hired by others. If you type Christian persecution into any search engine, you'll be confronted with a lot of horrendous material. Right now, many people who live in America say, well, thank God that kind of thing isn't happening here. Yes, thank God it isn't happening here. However, I'm sorry to say that there is no promise it won't happen here someday. We started off our talk today with a joke. The cannibal pizza, the one with everybody on it. Recall that the early Romans accused Christians of being cannibals. So imagine that they had TV back then. You're watching and you turn on a late-night comedy show. The host starts his monologue. He says, hey everybody, have you heard about the Christian pizza? That's a pizza with everybody on it. Imagine that you're watching this and you think, how stupid, that's not true. However, everyone around you is laughing hysterically. They're all laughing because they all believe the lies. What would it be like to turn on your TV today and see late-night TV hosts making jokes about Christians? Joke after joke after joke. About you, if you're a Christian. What would it be like to watch TV and on a regular basis you see Christians lied about, mocked, and laughed at? I'm afraid we're coming into a period where we may start seeing a lot more of that. For example, my wife and I went to see a Broadway show about 10 years ago. During the show, one of the characters made a comment that was very critical of evangelical Christianity. Now listen to this. The whole audience broke out in loud applause and cheers. I noticed that my wife and I were about the only people in the crowd who weren't clapping. So in some ways, the persecution has arrived. Right now, it's not as bad as other places in the world or at other times in church history. Sadly, I can't promise that we will avoid persecution in our lifetime. Now, what is our reaction to all this? Well, we have two choices. One reaction is to accept what Jesus says to us. If we choose to pursue righteousness, if we choose to become followers and representatives of Jesus, we will at some point in our lives face persecution. If we do, we can rejoice. Jesus tells us that people who are persecuted because of righteousness are blessed. They're happy. They've arrived in a wonderful place. They're blessed because they will be handsomely rewarded. In Matthew 5 and verse 12, Jesus said, "Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven." If you can accept this, you will receive a reward of unimaginable value someday. Or you can reject all of this. You can deny Jesus. Persecution is no fun. Sometimes life on earth can be pretty good. Sometimes we'd like to hang on to our possessions rather than have them confiscated. Sometimes we like being invited to the parties. The list goes on. Each of us faces a choice. We can accept or deny. Denial is an alarmingly easy thing to do. It can happen on many levels. First is complete rejection. Some people completely reject Christ. There have been numerous times in history when people have made a profession of faith and they might come to church for a while, but when their lifestyle is threatened, they throw in the towel. They simply reject Jesus in favor of whatever the world has to offer. Next, some people reject in part. In the days of the Roman Empire, at one point, the emperors, the supreme leaders, decided that they should be worshipped as gods. Failure to worship Caesar as God was seen as rebellion against the empire. Every so often, the authorities would come to people's homes with a piece of paper. The paper simply said, "I recognize that Caesar is God." If a person signed it, they could go back and worship whomever they wanted. You see, the Romans believed in something called a pantheon. That's a word that means collection of many gods. Romans preferred their gods, but they allowed the residents of conquered territories to worship other gods. The Greeks could worship Diana or Apollo or any Greek god they wanted. The Egyptians could worship Ra or Anubis or any other Egyptian god they wanted. All that people had to do was sign a little form once a year recognizing Caesar as God. Then people could go back to their god or gods. Christians refused to do this. They believed that there was only one God, and that led to persecution. All the things we discussed earlier. Now, wait a minute, did I say Christians refused? Well, not all Christians refused. Some signed the form. You see, sometimes the world wants you to completely reject Jesus. At other times, though, the world is not so strict. If you are willing to demote Jesus to a level where he is just another god, one of many, equal to all the other gods of this world, if you do that, you might be able to fit in. You might be able to escape persecution. This brings us to our final question. What will you do? Jesus has warned us in his Christian manifesto that those who follow him will at some point see persecution. They will see unjust hostility and mistreatment. This happens because the world is at war with God. The world doesn't trust God. They see God as a threat. So if you follow God, if you follow Jesus, you will be seen as a threat too. If you accept this, if you choose to continue as a disciple, Jesus says you will be richly rewarded. You will have a place in his kingdom. If you deny, now listen to this, it follows that there is no such reward. Will you follow Jesus? If you do, then the words of Jesus apply to you. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You just heard the message, Blessed Are the Persecuted by Phil Brainerd. If you want to hear more, come visit us. We're Trinity Church of Teaneck, New Jersey. Our website is www.trinityteaneck.org, or you can visit Phil's site, philbrainerd.com. May the Lord richly bless you.